we are going to be discussing the various historical rationales for public schools, particularly here in the United States. Now, first of all, this might seem very obvious, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Schooling and education are two slightly different things. Everybody gets an education no matter who you are, no matter where you come from, no matter what point in time you've ever lived. You are educated, whether it's an education that you receive in the ivory towers of Cambridge or an education you receive on the mean streets of Mumbai. Schools provide a particular kind of education. In particular, the formal education system that has developed in the United States that we're going to be thinking about when we're thinking about the rationales for education. These are our various rationales we'll be discussing during this module. Civic virtue, meritocracy, social mobility, social stability, economic efficiency, but maybe the grandest and the one that gins us up and gets us most excited and has the most inspiring implications is freedom. Freedom and liberty, this idea very much attached to the Enlightenment that many of our founding fathers had, that we needed a universal education system to flush out all of our old superstitions and replace them with scientific rationality and enlightenment. The idea that literacy could help provide that was very crucial. Do we really need schools to teach us to read? I see your question over there. What do we have? Look, today you can learn just about anything you want with a few hours on YouTube. It's a fair point. And to amplify it, during the American Revolution, about 85% of white males in New England were literate, compared to only about 60% in Old England. So no, one doesn't need schools in order to teach us to read. There were other reasons that many of our founding fathers stressed when they discussed universal education. One of them, civic virtue. Benjamin Rush, who was a doctor who lived in Pennsylvania, stressed this idea of civic virtue when he proposed a universal education system there. I'll give you a little bit of a flavor of Benjamin Rush's proposal. Let our pupil be taught that he does not belong to himself, but that he is public property. Let him be taught to love his family, but let him be taught at the same time that he must forsake and even forget them when the welfare of his country requires it. The idea of civic virtue is that good citizens are not just born, they have to be created, and schools are one of the principal ways that we can make that happen. This was an idea that Thomas Jefferson also shared, that we needed to instill these ideas of these basic skills of public debate, discourse, reason, in order to establish a good democracy. But Jefferson's vision was also freighted with what he thought of as this sort of natural aristocracy. Schools could be used to help us identify those people who possessed the talent and the skills, people not unlike Alexander Hamilton, in fact, who did not come to those by birth or by wealth, but instead because this was something that they naturally possessed. And schools could be a way that we could allow that cream to rise to the top. He proposed a sort of system in Virginia that would allow that to happen, with a series of competitive systems where if you were particularly deserving and you proved it in each of those school systems, you could attend William and Mary, which is where Thomas Jefferson had received his education. Now, this idea of a sort of talented tenth, to borrow the phrase that W.E.B. Du Bois would later use, is very akin to today's idea of a meritocracy that places even at the most prestigious schools like your Yales and your Harvards and your Dukes, that those spots should be reserved to those with the highest aptitude and not the highest net worth. And so perpetuating meritocracy is a very important rationale for education, not just in the time of Thomas Jefferson, but we might think of even today. I mean, wasn't the American Revolution about getting rid of government control over stuff? Why would the people want schools from the government to come in and teach people how to be patriots? Fair enough. And to your point, yet again, you have to remember that these systems that Rush and Jefferson proposed, they weren't enacted. It took something else to get legislatures to really pony up for school systems. So what was it? For one thing, a system of charity schools developed in places like New York City in order to deal with children of the poor, children of immigrants, children who many religious figures, many elites thought needed some sort of schooling in order to teach them moral virtues, teach them things and get rid of the things that their parents might otherwise instill in them. There was this idea that we needed schools in order to promote social stability in places, again, like New York. Early industrialization, similarly in the rest of New England, was also an impetus for legislatures ponying up for public school systems to try to deal with the social chaos and disorder and class tension that might emerge as society shifted away from a purely agrarian farming system to one where we had emerging textile industries and other sorts of labor that they feared might create a system like Europe. So schools were a tool for providing social stability. A lot of this wasn't really about social mobility, but that does come into the picture, particularly in the mid to late 19th century. We have the closing of the frontier, which, though mythical in many ways, and the frontier often very overstated, was something that struck many policy elites during the turn of the century. And so the high school movement in particular was a way to address these issues of social mobility in a place that no longer had land that could be that sort of steam valve for society. And so social mobility became an increasingly important role that schools could play. Many captains of industry, moreover, thought that there could be some sort of vocational value in schools, that actually the point of a lot of the boring stuff that we do in schools would be a way to show to future employers that you could handle the boring, rote nature of working the assembly line. And so schools, in this way, were providing both that sort of social mobility and social stability function as they continued to develop during the 19th and early 20th century. Do we really need taxpayer dollars to teach us how to work an assembly line? Taxes. How could we discuss schools without talking about taxes? And taxes were a big reason that schools were not supported from the public level during the 19th century. And they continue to be a very, very sticky issue when we discuss improving education, whether we need to invest more tax dollars. This brings us, though, to this final rationale that we'll discuss here, which is economic efficiency. And this is the way that a lot of folks deal with this question of it costs a lot of money to run a school. Why are we going to have to spend all this money for schools? The idea of economic efficiency is that schools will actually promote economic growth, that school systems, by figuring out how to allocate the right people to the right jobs, by teaching students these skills that will promote innovation and economic growth, that they will return to a community way more than the community puts into the schools. Now, this is maybe today the most discussed rationale for schools. We need schools to be economically competitive. We need schools so that we're not losing out to other players, whether it's China or Japan, whether it's Europe. But this idea that schools could help improve the bottom line for our society is something that was discussed in the 19th century, but almost with a sort of embarrassment. When Horace Mann brings the rationale for public schools to the legislature of Massachusetts in the 1840s and is really pressing his case, he mentions this idea that a community will get more out of schools and wealth than the taxes that it puts into it. But he says that that should be the least of the reasons why we invest in schools. And yet it's striking, if we think about how things change over time, that this rationale of economic efficiency today might be the most compelling reason that a lot of politicians give for why we need to invest in education, compared to these many other rationales that continue to play a part in our justifications.